Hello, welcome back to another video. This week, I discovered a new use for color pencils during a mixed media study, talked about how to expand on a limited selection of supplies, and gave some tips on how to simplify complex patterns. The materials I used included Arch's hot press watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 pencil set of Polychromos color pencils, a Derwent pencil extender, Derwent Drawing Pencils in light sienna and smoke blue, along with the red 6 pencil set, Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials split primary set, and Dr. P.H. Martin's pen white ink. The first thing I did was transfer the sketch onto the Arch's paper using a light box. If you've seen past videos, you'll know I normally do this with a graphite pencil, but this time I decided to use my Polychromos. I already use colored lines in my professional digital work. Doing this helps unify the lines with colors and makes it easier for me to paint over them later. I decided to try transferring this process to my traditional studies, and after a few tests, I happily discovered that Polychromos don't dissolve or bleed under watercolors. I know many artists use Prismacolor Layers pencils for this, but I much prefer the Polychromos. After this little epiphany, I was eager to move into the actual study. I began by blocking in the lightest colors on the figure using flat washes. I waited for areas to dry and moved around the study, making sure to look at my reference often. Besides the drying time, this part went quickly because I pre-mixed all my colors when completing the thumbnails on the right side of the paper. Let me know if you want to see the mixing and testing phase of these studies in future videos, and I'll be sure to include them. Once everything was dry, I began to build up value and saturation with more pigmented color. In the reference, the shadow on the left side of the figure's face is a deep brown, but my first shadow layers were orange. Why? During the thumbnail phase, I found that going straight to deep brown created a cool, muddy effect I didn't like. I preferred this deeper brown when it was glazed over a warm underpainting, so I carried it over into the final study. Watercolor's transparency gives me the ability to make minute adjustments like this to saturation and value while still retaining luminosity. Unfortunately, that same transparency sometimes causes problems. Here, I wish I used fewer layers on the face. Even 100% cotton paper can only withstand so many brush strokes and layers before it begins to break down. The main issue I encountered was blending. A couple weeks ago, I talked about blending out edges with a different, clean brush. That process worked here, but I had too much water on the brush, which caused back runs along the edges. I tried to clean these by diluting the entire wash. After doing this several times, I noticed some uneven texture in the paper, which made me pause. I decided to move on to other areas, which went smoother since I only used 1 or 2 layers on them. When I returned to the face, I still struggled to build deep values, but at least some of the areas turned out better, like the eyeshadow. I think I could have mitigated my problems with fewer, more saturated layers. Using a smaller brush that held less water for blending would have also helped. I think this goes back to my perennial problem, water control. This skill is the foundation of watercolor, and something I still struggle with. I have good and bad days, but I know the key to improvement and consistency is practice. I tried to take the small wins like the figure's hands and eyeshadow, while pushing ahead through the growing pains. The final step was the background. I first laid down a wash of clean water, then quickly painted the deep brown on top while it was still wet. The first layer wasn't even, so I added a second on top. While the final still isn't where I want it to be, it's a decent base for the next phase. After untaping the study and placing it at an angle, I started refining and correcting mistakes with my trusty Polychromos and the Derwent Drawing Pencils. Usually, this means cleaning up the edges. My edge control with a brush is still questionable, especially if I'm working on a small scale. The smallest brush I have is a size 7 round, and there's only so much I can do on a study this size. Freshly sharpened brown and magenta pencils helped create a clean separation between the figure and the background. In both my traditional and digital art, I like to focus on transition points, whether that's transitions between light and shadow or between entire objects. These transitions tend to have a ton of detail and do most of the heavy lifting when describing form and texture. This is why I spent the most time in areas like cloth folds and the edge of her eyeshadow. I took the longest time on the face in general because it's the focal point. Humans instinctively look at the face first when we see someone, so concentrating detail here helps naturally guide the eye. I took advantage of the control I have over color pencils to fix her pupils, lashes, and nose. Sometimes it only takes a single stroke to change the entire perception of the area, which is why working small is difficult but also rewarding. From there, it was a matter of layering, blending, and repeating that process. Let's take a moment to talk about expanding a collection of art supplies instead. I started out the series of studies with only 12 Polychromos pencils. A month ago, I added the Derwent Drawing Pencil set, and this week I added 4 more colors, though I only used 2 of them this time. Why did I choose these colors? I started with the Polychromos set because it was the only professional set I had, and it had all the primary colors plus both the lightest and deepest values available to tint and shade with. This was enough for me for all my studies until late March when I ran out of white. I wanted to try a more opaque white, and the earth tones in the Derwent set helped mix skin tones and natural scenery. My latest expansion rounded out the Derwent set with the missing cool tones I needed for areas like the white dress. I'm planning to do something similar with my watercolors. I started with the primaries, and over time, once I really know these colors, I'll fill in the gaps with colors I know I use a lot. I recommend a similar approach if you're like me and have limited storage space and are on a budget. The final thing I want to touch on has to do with technique instead of supplies. When I first looked at the reference photo, I noticed that there were many little details from the jewelry to the lace edging and cutouts on her dress. If I had a larger canvas and more time, I could capture each detail, but this was only meant to be a study. At 5 by 7 inches, there was no way for me to include everything with the supplies I had. That's okay. In fact, it gave me an opportunity to practice simplification. Instead of trying to draw the lace and wires, I focused on the overall values. Where was the light? Where was the dark? And which shadows told the most about how forms fit in 3D space? This made things like the cast shadows on her hand important, while the delicate twists of metal for each link could be simplified into colorful and dark dots on top of a bright base. After adding in some final highlights with white pen ink, I called it done. This study was frustrating at times, but I'm glad I found a new technique and that my new pencils fit nicely into my existing collection. Thanks for watching to the end, and as always, I hope you created something that brought you joy this week. I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!